Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at something called the imperative mood. So if you haven't seen this before, you want a quick review. The imperative mood is how we make commands in Latin, or how we tell people to do things. And what we're going to do in this video is explore how that's different from our normal use of verbs and how we form these. So the first thing we want to think about is what are commands, right? And it sounds silly, but you want to make sure that you do understand what they are. This is if you were to say something like jump, look, be quiet, sit down, run, like whatever it is, you're ordering someone to do something. So when you think about it, when you say jump, right, that's different from saying we jump or I will jump, right? It doesn't have a person associated with it. You can tell by just knowing English that we're ordering someone or a group of people to do something, right? That's the command. So these are different from, like I said, saying you run, I am quiet, or we look, anything like that, right? It's a different form, even in English, right? You might not have thought about it, but it does look different and sound different when you're commanding someone to do something. So you can tell right off the bat that something's different, right? Something doesn't quite add up here when you really think about what's going on. So in Latin, we call these imperatives, and it comes from the verb imperare, which means to command, okay? So how do these work? How do we actually form imperatives? The first thing that you need to know about these is that it really depends, right? The way we spell it depends on whether you're talking to one person or to more than one person. Okay, we call these singular and plural imperatives. So the singular imperative, the singular command, is exactly what it sounds like. You're commanding one person to do something. The plural imperative is when you're commanding more than one person to do something. The reason I'm breaking this down is oftentimes, especially with my younger students, something I see is they'll equate singular imperative not to who's being commanded, but who's making the command. So they think if one person is making a command, it has to be singular, right? And if more than one person are making a command, it has to be plural. It's actually the other way around. So a singular imperative doesn't have anything to do with who's commanding. It's how many people are you commanding to do something. Same with plural. It's about how many people you're telling to do or not do something. So one person singular, more than one person plural. It's important just to get that straight. The second thing that's important that you need to understand about imperatives is that you can have two different types of commands. I can either tell someone to do something or to not do something, right? So you can even think about this in English. If you say, hey, run, right? That's different than saying don't run. Okay, we call these positive and negative imperatives. So the positive imperative is when you're commanding someone to do something, right? The negative imperative is when you're commanding someone to not do something. So you just want to have the terminology down. Hopefully it's making some sense, right? Positive and negative, do it, don't do it. It actually does make some pretty good sense, right? Same with singular and plural. So once you have the idea down, the question is, how do we form these, right? And again, it depends on what you're trying to say. So is it a positive imperative? Is it negative, singular, or plural? These are all the things we need to unpack because you're going to spell the verb differently depending on what you're trying to say. So the first thing we want to start with are positive commands. How do we tell people to do something? Okay. For the singular positive imperative, it's really straightforward. Just go to the infinitive, which is the second part of your verb, the second principal part, and drop the RE. That's literally it. That should sound familiar because the singular positive imperative is actually the same thing as your present stem, right? If you're thinking of verb conjugation. So for some examples, on the left, I gave you 4 infinitives from the different conjugations, right? So for ambulare, to walk, the singular imperative is ambulare without the RE. It becomes ambula. Ambula means walk. If you put an exclamation point after it, it means I'm telling one person to walk. Same thing with sedere, that becomes sede. Mitere becomes mite, and audire becomes audi, right? So when you say ambula, I'm saying walk. Sede means sit. Mite means send, and audi means listen, right, or hear. Okay, these are singular imperatives. I'm telling one person to do something, right? They're positive. What if I'm telling more than one person to do something, though? This would be the plural positive imperative. So here you do the same thing. You go to the infinitive and you drop the RE, but the difference is you add a TE. And I put a little note here for third conjugation verbs, that final E becomes an I in front of the TE, and I'll show you what I mean in a second. But otherwise, it's pretty straightforward. Just literally take the singular positive imperative, add a TE, and you have a plural positive imperative, right? It's nothing too crazy here. So ambulare, the plural imperative, becomes ambulate. And for sedere, it becomes sedete, and mitite, and audite, right? I'm just sticking a TE onto that singular positive imperative. Okay. The one difference that I highlighted in blue here is mitere, a third conjugation verb. If I drop the re off mite, or off mitere rather, I'm expecting mite, right? M-I-T-T-E. That was my singular positive imperative. But when I make it plural, that E becomes an I. This is what I meant in the note before. So it's not mitete, E-T-E, it's mitete, I-T-E. It still means the same thing. So you notice in my translation, I still wrote walk, sit, send. It's because in English, we don't change our translation if it's singular or plural. So if I tell, one person to sit down, right, maybe one student, if they're acting a little rowdy in class, I'd say sit down. If I'm telling a group of my students to sit down, I would still say sit down, right? So the imperative is the same. Usually in English, we put something in front of it. So I'll say, hey, you, sit down, or hey, you all, sit down, right? That would be the vocative case in Latin, and I'll show you usually imperatives take a vocative. So the positive imperatives, pretty straightforward. The negatives, I actually think, are a little bit easier, right? They're going to be similar. There's nothing too crazy about any of these. But let's think about negatives. How do we tell someone or a group of people not to do something? So for the singular negative imperative, all you do is take the infinitive and you put the word noli in front of it, right? Really is that simple. It's sort of the equivalent in English of putting don't, right? So you can say jump, right? You're telling someone to do something. Don't jump means you're telling them not to do it. Noli is the equivalent in English of don't, right? That's kind of what's happening here. So for singular negative imperatives, I would take ambulare, my infinitive, put noli in front of it, and I have noli ambulare. That means don't walk, right? Noli sedere means don't sit. Noli mitere means don't send, and noli audire means don't listen, okay? And again, we're not changing anything in terms of the infinitive. There's no vowel flip, so it's really straightforward. We're just taking noli and putting it in front of the infinitive, right? Very, very straightforward. So what if you want to do a plural negative imperative, right? What if I want to tell a group of people to not do something? Well, here, what you do is you take noli and you stick a te on the end of it, and you have nolite. You put nolite in front of the infinitive, and you have a plural negative command. And that should look familiar because we just saw with singular plural imperatives, you put a te on the end of that stem, right, on the infinitive without the re. So adding a te to make it plural should feel pretty familiar. Here, though, we're not really touching the verb, the infinitive. We're just putting the te on the end of noli. So here's an example. Those same verbs, if I want to have plural negative imperatives, I'd say nolite ambulare, nolite sedere, nolite mitere, and nolite audire, right? Don't walk, don't sit, don't send, don't listen, okay? So hopefully that's making some sense. Once you get used to it, it's actually very easy to spot. And what you're really looking for in a textbook or a Latin text, they'll probably add exclamation points, right, to really emphasize that this is a command. So it should be pretty easy to spot when you see that exclamation point, and you just get used to the rules of how we how we make these imperatives. So just a side note, you've actually seen imperatives before, I would imagine. Not 100% sure, but usually in Latin classes, one of the first things we teach you how to do or say is salve, right? Which means hello. You learn salve is how you say hello to one group of people. And maybe your teacher, when they're saying good morning to everyone in the class in at the beginning of the day, they'll say salvete, right? Salve and salvete are both positive imperatives, right? It's from the verb salvere, which means to be well or to be in good health, basically, right? So when you say salve, you're not really saying hello. You're actually commanding someone to be in good health, to be well, right? And in English, we kind of, translate that, I guess, into our version of hello, right? But that's all that's happening here. That's why you have salve and salvete. They are imperatives. Same thing with goodbye, wale and walete, right? Walere literally means to be strong. Same idea. So when you say wale to someone, you're like, hey, I'm commanding you to be strong. Again, that kind of idea of being in good health, right? Wale and walete are both imperatives. So you might have seen these before. Awe is another one that comes up a lot, right? So there you go. You might have been dealing with imperatives your whole time in your Latin career and just didn't realize it. But to add a little intrigue to all this, right, a little confusion, there are irregulars, right? Of course there are, because Latin has a bunch of irregular rules, right? So there's 4 irregular verbs that make irregular imperatives that you want to know. They're dico dicere, which means to say or to tell, duco ducere, facio facere, and fero fere. So the good news is we're only talking about the positives here, right? The positive, or sorry, rather the singular positive imperatives. That's the only ones that really get changed, right? That you have to worry about. The negatives are the exact same thing. You would say noli dicere, noli te ducere, right? You wouldn't change that. But when you're dealing with a singular imperative, if you think of these verbs, right? So for instance, dicere, if you drop the re off dicere, it should be dice, tell. But you get rid of the e. It's just deek, right? Instead of ducere becoming duque, it becomes duke. And instead of facere becoming face, it becomes fac. And instead of, be careful how you say that one, by the way. And instead of fere becoming, I guess there wouldn't be a letter there. It would be fair. So maybe this one makes sense. But the idea is there's no vowel on the end of it, right? We've been seeing with all the other imperatives, there's either an A, an I, an E, something. These, you get rid of it. So it's a minor little tweak. You're probably still going to be able to figure it out because of the exclamation point. And, there's not a major difference between deek, which means tell, and this hypothetical dike, right? If you just didn't remember it was an irregular verb, you'd probably still be able to figure it out. And for the plurals, it's the same idea, right? You're just putting an I in front of it. Right, these verbs are third conjugation verbs, basically most of them, right? So putting an ite kind of makes sense. But this is how you do the plural, right? Dicite, ducite, facite, ferte, right? And again, same thing, you're commanding someone to do something, right? It's a positive command. It's just spelled slightly differently. So these four you want to put in your back pocket. And again, just as your friendly YouTube Latin teacher, be very careful with faccio facere and how you choose to pronounce it in class. Always a problem, might get you in trouble. Be careful out there, all right? Otherwise, they're pretty straightforward. So let's just do some examples, right? So you can see these in action. So the first thing I want to do is show you how you can make all of them. So for a first conjugation verb, again, if I had ambulo, ambulare, to walk, for the positive imperatives, I would take ambulare, drop the re, and you have ambula, which means walk. Add a te, you have ambulate. That means I'm telling a bunch of people to walk, right? For the negatives, just put noli plus the infinitive. So it'll be noli ambulare, don't walk, and nolite ambulare, don't walk. Pretty straightforward. Here's a second conjugation verb, right? Sede o sedere. I would take sedere, drop the re. I have sede. That's my singular positive imperative. It means sit down, right? Sedete means, hey, a bunch of you, sit down. For the negatives, we have noli sedere, right? Noli plus the infinitive, and nolite sedere, which means don't sit, right? These are the negative imperatives. For a third conjugation verb, same idea. You have deligere. You would drop the re. You have delige, which means choose. But for the plural positive imperative, it's not deligate, ete, it's ite, right? So deligate, right? Choose. It's like a bunch of people to choose. And then for the negative, same thing. Noli deligere and nolite deligere, right? Don't choose. But the third conjugation is the one where in that plural positive imperative, you're putting ite instead of ete. That's the only difference, right? And if you felt comfortable with verb conjugation so far, you're probably used to that idea of flipping an e to an I when you're dealing with third conjugation verbs. Okay? The last one, fourth conjugation. If you had redeo, redire, to return, right, just drop the re off the infinitive. You have ready, which means return. Redite, you're telling a bunch of people to come back to return. Then noli redire, nolite redire. It's just noli or nolite plus the infinitive. These get very repetitive, and with a little bit of practice, you're going to be experts at this. It's not too bad to figure out. But what do they look like in sentences? So I pulled these from our dear friends at Magistrula, right? If you're wondering if they look familiar to you, that's all they are. So if you were to say, in parvam vilam fuge, fuge is my imperative. It's singular. I know because there's no te on the end of it. I took fugere, right? Fugio, fugere. I dropped the re. So I'm saying flee, fuge, right? Flee into the parvam vilam, into the small house. That's a singular positive imperative. If I said mecum prandete, right? Prandere means to eat, or I think it's specifically to eat lunch, maybe. I might be making that up. But prandete is the plural positive, right? The te on the end of it tells you I'm telling more than one person to eat, right? Mecum means with me. So I'm saying eat with me, right? Telling a bunch of people, hey, mecum prandete, come eat lunch with me. Got it. Now we have some negatives. If you said noli equum subarbere relinquere, noli relinquere is your singular negative imperative, right? Don't leave, noli relinquere, right? And a lot of times you do see it separated out like this, where you have noli and then a bunch of stuff and then the infinitive at the end. Don't get freaked out by that, right? They don't necessarily have to be right next to each other. But you're saying don't leave the equum, the horse, under the tree, right? Just a negative command. And if we wanted a plural negative, it would be nolite. So nolite legere, right? Nolite de consulibus legere means don't read. Nolite legere, right? Don't read. The TE on nolite is telling you that it's a bunch of people I'm commanding not to do something. So don't read about the consuls, right? De consulibus. Pretty straightforward. So just to recap everything we did, right? The imperative mood. So commands, like we said, they're different in form and use than normal verbs, right? Or normal actions. You can hear it in English. There's a difference between saying I am jumping and jump, right? It sounds different. Same thing in Latin. The imperative mood is how we express a command in Latin, right? We use the imperative. There's positive and negatives, right? Depending on if you're commanding or telling someone to do something or not do something. And there's singular and plural forms. So if I'm telling one person to do something, that's different than telling a bunch of people to do something. So there's really 4 forms, right? 4 different versions of the imperative for every single verb you're going to come across. The imperative, it often goes with the vocative case. I mentioned this earlier in the video. Usually you're talking to someone. You say, hey, Marcus, right? Marque. I don't know, whatever you want to say. Noli legere, right? Noli legere, Marque. Don't read, Marcus. I don't know why you'd say that, but you could. That's what's going on there, right? Usually with a vocative case now because you're talking to someone, you're commanding them. And there's 4 irregular imperatives that you want to memorize and know. They get easier because they are pretty common, right? So for instance, deek, speak, is like one of the most common irregular imperatives I would say that you're going to run into. Once you practice with them, you'll be fine. I wouldn't stress out about it. If you're looking for more practice on this, like I always tell you on my quick plug, I would use Magistrula. Again, I don't own Magistrula, just a big fan, but you saw in the sentences I put here, right? I pulled those off Magistrula. You can set it to specifically use imperatives, and you'll get a bunch. If you just cycle through, you'll run into a bunch of them. It gives you vocab help. It's a pretty easy way to make sure that you feel comfortable with this. All right. So hopefully that made some sense. Imperatives are not as scary as they might sound. They're actually pretty straightforward, which is why a lot of times you'll learn them early on in your Latin career. And once you get the hang of it, a couple basic rules and a lot of practice, you'll be fine. You won't run into any issues. If you have any questions at all, feel free to put them in the comments below. Happy to help. Otherwise, just practice as much as you can read. Do that. The more you read, the more you're going to see imperatives, and the more you practice them, the more comfortable you'll feel with the translation and forming them, right? You never want to be afraid to try to write your own sentences in Latin. Feel free to write a couple sentences with the imperative. It's not too bad. Good luck.